Hello, everyone. I'm Linda Zerilli, Director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, and I'm delighted to introduce today's event, A Desire for History, Creating Queer Archives at the University of Chicago. Before I introduce our speakers for today and the project itself, I want to give you just a little bit of background on the center. The center was founded in 1996 and promotes the practice of critical thinking through interdisciplinary engagement on questions of gender and sexuality. We offer a major and a minor in gender and sexuality studies, as well as a graduate certificate. I'm also happy to announce, for those of you who know the U of C system, that this year we have a new college core curriculum class, which is called Gender and Sexuality in World Civilizations. We house and fund up to 8 residential, postdoctoral, and dissertation fellowships annually who work across the humanities and the social sciences. Additionally, we have about 9 provost-funded faculty fellowships, which allow us to support an array of research of projects that get run through the center. So, for example, one of these projects is run by Lauren Berland, who is a professor of English here, and that's the LGBTQ Studies Project. And Lauren brings a number of really exciting gay, lesbian, and queer thinkers to campus to engage with our students. We also have another innovative project here, which is called Artist Salon, which is being run by Professor Hilary Chute in the English department. And she brought a graphic artist, Allison Bechdel, here last year for a whole quarter, and they taught a class together, and Allison did an exhibit in our, at that time, different looking space from this. This is all new space, but Allison was kind enough to allow us to hang her wonderful images in our dilapidated space. So that really helped us make the transition to this. A key objective of the center is to facilitate the many and make visible, really, the many contributions of women and LGBTQ peoples to culture and society. In this spirit, the center undertook a project titled On Equal Terms, Educating Women at the University of Chicago, which culminated in a major exhibit at the Regenstein Library in 2009. The project was run by graduate students Monica Mercado, who you'll meet today, and Catherine Turk, with the assistance from English professor and at that time center director Deborah Nelson, and at that time assistant director Gina Olson, who you will also meet today. On Equal Terms was based on archival materials and, most importantly, on over 70 oral histories taken from alumni, faculty, and staff from 1935 to the present. Apart from making visible the histories of the many women who contributed to the intellectual life of the university and beyond, one of the most rewarding aspects of the project was how it energized students. It energized them to look beyond the official histories told by institutions about themselves to the counter-narratives waiting to be told by those who know where to look. It was students who conducted the oral histories, students who gathered the archival materials, and ultimately students who made On Equal Terms the incredible exhibit it turned out to be. Once again, you can check out our website to get information on this exhibit and on the center at large. That's gendersexuality.uchicago.edu. The project you're going to hear about today represents what I take to be another milestone in the center's contribution to the creation of alternative public histories. I'm delighted to say that both Gina Olson, who is now the associate director of the center, and Monica Mercado, who's a PhD candidate in history and a center fellow, are at the center of this project, and they are as instrumental to it as they were to the creation of On Equal Terms. So I'd like to start by introducing our Associate Director, Gina Olson, who will then introduce Monica Mercado, who will give you a lot of the guts of the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, and welcome everyone today. I will talk a little bit about the project, just give you an overview, and then Monica will show us some research, very exciting things. CSGS has an ongoing undergraduate internship program in oral history. As Linda mentioned, 70 interviews were taken with women alumni, and those were collected between 2006 and 2008. And we aim to collect 100 interviews of LGBTQ alumni, faculty, and staff by 2015 with this project. The center has offered 4 archives-based undergraduate courses between 2008 and 2014, giving graduate students subject specialists experience in designing and teaching history of gender and sexuality, as well as giving undergraduates a hands-on experience in original research and using the archives at Special Collections Research Center. The project hosts a series of programs with scholars in the field, including Jenny Breyer from UIC, curator of the Chicago History Museum's Out in Chicago exhibition, and she spoke with us in 2012. Nan Boyd, who's a professor at San Francisco State University and a leader at the GLBT Historical Society of San Francisco, gave a lecture and a workshop on oral history in 2013. And we are planning more such events later this year. The project also supports the work of 2 graduate student researchers who are coordinating plans for the exhibition in Special Collections in 2015 and overseeing the undergraduate interns learning oral history methods and conducting interviews. And so I'm going to introduce one of those graduate students, the wonderful Monica Mercado, who Linda has mentioned, worked on the Experience of Women project and has been absolutely crucial to this project. She is a PhD in history, and she researches 19th and 20th century U.S. women's history and the impact of religion on American culture. She was a curator on Unequal Terms, Educating Women at the University of Chicago, 2007-2009, and she teaches for gender and sexuality studies and is a former fellow of the center. Please welcome Monica.
All right. It's the first time we've used this room in its full capacity, so bear with me through all the various technology. But thank you, Gina and Linda. For the next 20 minutes, I'd like to show some of our current work and do a little bit of contextualization of other contemporary efforts to document alternative histories and build feminist and queer archives. We'll leave time for questions and a reception, and some time to take a look at the material stuff that our undergraduate interns have been collecting in the last year. So, as Gina and Linda mentioned, this project in some ways is very much an outgrowth of the research done for the 2009 campus exhibition On Equal Terms, Educating Women at the University of Chicago, which I co-organized. So for the exhibition and the publication, and we hope you will take a copy home today, there are copies on the table, we displayed a number of papers, archival photographs, books, and ephemera, illustrating the consequences of co-education at the U of C. We followed the way that women's communities formed at the university over time. We were interested in how women at the university have understood their conditions and worked visibly or invisibly to give other women access to knowledge. We were interested in women's social lives, in their academic lives, in their political and organizational capacities. And as Linda sort of mentioned, we found stories that seemed to fall out of the university's understanding of its own histories of itself, but we thought deserved to be there. So based on the success of this exhibition, I think we decided to think about this new research focus, one that could shed light on LGBTQ individuals and communities at the U of C. Here, I knew from this initial research that the archives at Special Collections were almost silent. Historians had organized an exhibition before my time at Regenstein Library in 2000 called Homosexuality in the City, A Century of Research at the University of Chicago. That was curated by Chad Heap, who was then a graduate student. He's now a professor of history at George Washington U. That exhibition focused near exclusively on the academic study of homosexuality in the first half of the 20th century, when Chicago sociologists such as Ernest Burgess saw the city as their laboratory, vice and all. So when we found rich collections about women, and we knew we had significant collections about early ways of documenting homosexuality as a pathology, we had very little to document the lived experiences of LGBTQ individuals and communities at the U of C. So you can see how the current project emerges from those previous exhibitions. And my work on this history, however, I think has one other starting point. And there's a handout, a two-sided handout with some of these ads. If you don't have one, they're in the table in the back. So in January 2012, as I had just come onto this project, Special Collections Research Center opened a show called We Are Chicago, Student Life in the Collections of the University of Chicago Archives. We Are Chicago featured recent donations to their collections, rarely seen materials like t-shirts and posters, publications, student memorabilia. An archive staff member, Isabel Gonzalez, who's now at UIC, approached me during the run of the show, and she directed me to an exhibition case on activism. She told me that when mounting the show, it seemed clear to her and the other archivists that to do an exhibition on student life and not mention LGBTQ organizing would be a major flaw. So Isabel dug into the Chicago Maroon, the student newspaper, and found the 4 news clippings on your handout. She did really the initial work for me here. The first one from April 1969 calls for anyone interested in starting a student homophile league 3 months before Stonewall changed that vocabulary. The second ad from December 1969, the first appearance of a so-called roommate classified ad by a gay student. The third, which is also reproduced on the screen, announces university gay liberation, reflecting, of course, the broader gay lib discourse, replacing that homophile language. And the fourth ad on that sheet, February 1970, the first U of C gay and lesbian dance announced to take place in our dearly departed Pierce Hall. I was incredibly grateful that Isabel did the initial work of tracking these down. And with that photocopy in hand, 9 months later, in September of 2012, I walked to my first oral history interview with David Goldman, class of 1972, at his home in the Castro. David insisted we sit on his outdoor patio, a big no-no in oral history recording. But it was my first interview, I was nervous, and it was a sunny September afternoon in San Francisco, so how could I say no? David and I talked for about an hour about his activism. He was incredibly precocious, had come out in high school in 1960s Manhattan. He arrived at the U of C in 1968, and then I asked him about Stonewall. I'll play his short answer now, but the sound is a little funny because we are outside. While you were in Chicago, I mean, did Stonewall appear as something that you were
I was
on the
away at
radar?
UC Camp when Stonewall occurred. I was at the National UC Camp in Interlochen in the summers of 69 and 68. And so I missed it, but when I got home, I immediately went down to the village and found out what was going on. And that got me to want to get involved in starting a gay group at the University of Chicago in the fall of 69. Murray Edelman placed an ad in the Maroon asking people to meet at Ida Noyes Hall, not Ida Noyes Hall, in some lounge, I forget where.
But on campus.
Some campus lounge, and I got there late because I learned about it too late, but eventually there were more ads placed in the room. We started meeting, and we formed the University of Chicago Gay Liberation.
So if you didn't hear that, they formed the University of Chicago Gay Liberation. There it was. Within the first 8 minutes of the project's first oral history interview, we had figured out those Maroon ads. David went on to tell me that ad for a roommate was the student group's way of secretly making contacts for the burgeoning gay lib without drawing a lot of attention to themselves. The radio show on WHPK was his doing, and the Gay Liberation Dance at Pierce Tower was one of the first advertised gay lib dances held in the entire city of Chicago. Because so many people came from off campus, it actually did attract the ire of the administration, who asked that these dances move off-site. So we could spend the whole rest of this afternoon listening to David's wonderful interview, but it's safe to say that as we continued talking in San Francisco on that September afternoon, I breathed a huge sigh of relief. Maybe this idea we had for an archive of LGBTQ history was actually doable. A month after the interview, David mailed me a copy of his student handbook for 1971, which is displayed here today. He had circled the listing for gay liberation, the first time the group had been acknowledged in an official university publication. I'd like to take a step back now and talk a little bit about our project and why oral history, in particular for queer studies. So in his path-breaking history, Gay New York, former center director and historian George Chauncey wrote, "Early in my research, it has become clear that oral histories would be the single most important source of evidence concerning the internal workings of the gay world. This is precisely because of the nature of the archive, I would say, which excludes as much as it includes." Indeed, oral history has become sort of central to telling queer stories. The use of oral history method stems back to the field's social history moorings, the historian Nan Boyd tells us, where historians of the dispossessed found themselves lacking print sources and turned to live historical actors for information about the recent past. Boyd notes as well that this research pays a major debt to feminist ethnography. She has written, "Feminist researchers try to empower rather than exploit historical narrators by trusting their voices and positioning narrators as historical experts. This idea fundamentally shapes the work we're doing on this project." The name of our project, Closeted Out, reflects some of the questions Boyd and other researchers in LGBT history ponder about our method. They ask these kinds of questions. What has it meant for narrators to talk openly with researchers about queer life, especially when queer genders, sexualities, and desires have been protectively hidden or vowed to secrecy? Our project, like a growing number of queer oral history projects across the nation, takes on these untold stories and invisible lives. So as Gina and Linda mentioned, since my first interview with David Goldman in September 2012, our crack team of undergraduate interns who are much better at oral history than I am have conducted 70 interviews, and we're planning to do about 30 more this academic year. Alumni in particular have told us they want to give back to the university in some way, and they really do have a sense of history here. We hear over and over that someone volunteered because they thought the story should be told. From these interviews, we're beginning to learn more about student organizing in particular, but also campus life. We've learned that Wiebold Hall, and in particular the basement men's bathroom, was a prime cruising spot for men on campus. We've learned more about anti-gay harassment in the late 80s and early 90s. We've learned about the difficulty students once had if they wanted to study or write about gay topics, and the flourishing of LGBT studies among grad students in the past 2 decades. We've learned who was dating whom and why it mattered or didn't matter, who came out immediately and who came out years after college. We see how gay community has grown and changed since the era of gay lib. So, on to building a material collection. We've asked our oral history narrators if they could look through their drawers, under their beds, and their closets and their attics to see if they have any stuff, papers, photos, files, ephemera, to illustrate their stories. We've laid out some of those items today. In the rest of my slides, I'll give you a quick preview of what we've also located at Special Collections. So we've asked alumni to search through their own files. These flyers join just a handful already present at Special Collections, in which we see connections between the university and citywide movements. The Chicago Maroon student newspaper donated its photo archive to Special Collections recently. Here we see the Maroon sent reporters and a photographer to the 1987 unfurling of the entire AIDS quilt on the National Mall. Here, Chicago students chalking outside the reg when a portion of the AIDS quilt was displayed on campus. And here, Gala, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance, marching in the city's Pride Parade. There are a few existing collections in the university archives that do deal directly with LGBT politics. So Special Collections holds the records of the Chicago chapter of ACT UP, for example. But so far, what I've shown you documents really a political and activist history. And we're also trying to document more individual or intimate histories. A few months ago, one of our undergraduate interns interviewed Bert Harrell, a graduate of the Divinity School, who was president of the gay and lesbian organization Gala in 1990. After the interview, we mentioned to Bert that I had been teaching an LGBTQ history class for the center. He asked what we were reading, and I mentioned that my students really enjoyed essays on gay history by the late community historian Alan Berube. Berube had actually attended the University of Chicago and dropped out just months before he would have graduated in 1968. So Bert immediately emailed us a scan of the cover page of Berube's most famous work, Coming Out Under Fire, the first history of gay men and women in World War II. I'll let Bert speak for himself. He wrote, "One more item for the scrapbook, a scan of the title page from my copy of a book at a Hyde Park author signing. During Campus Gay Pride Week in 1990, Gala sponsored the book signing at SEM Co-op, which I believe was the first gay author at the co-op, because I recall the manager being supportive when I asked for it on the phone, but initially apprehensive about the event, fear of no sales. The event was a success." The book is Coming Out Under Fire by Alan Berube, Harrell reminds me, a U of C alum, about gays in the military during World War II. Alan inscribed my copy with special thanks and told me he wished that there had been a Gala organization when he was an undergrad in the 60s. So I love Alan Berube's inscription to Bert, which if you can't read it says, "Thanks for making it possible for me to finally come out in Hyde Park." It reminds us that despite these waves of student activism on campus, not everyone can be or wants to be out on the quadrangles during their time here. It also hints at an issue of generations that our project explores. What did campus look like in Berube's 1960s versus Bert Harrell's late 80s, for example? Berube was an undergraduate student, Harrell a graduate student. Young alumni have donated photographs of parties and of club meetings, posters and t-shirts, records from their organizations. Dina Vanderwall, class of 1996, has offered some of the lesbian zines she made while in college. So we're interested in documenting not only formal campus organizations, but also what students do in their dorm rooms and apartments. So, for example, while we're interested in flyers for formally university-sanctioned events, yes, Genderfuck, the annual Pride Week dance, we're also interested in the undercurrents. So, possibly familiar to some of the undergrads in the room, one of our recent gifts was Disorientation, the alternative student guide to campus that circulates in hard copy and also as a Google Doc. Disorientation tells you how to throw a party off campus so that the cops won't get called, but it also offers sections on social justice, Hyde Park history, and my favorite, some basic gender and sexuality terms to help you get started, which is actually really helpful. A document like Disorientation, in combination with the oral histories for us, is, I would argue, a window on student consciousness, helping us, again, like Linda said, document a different kind of university voice than is found in the official websites, admissions materials, official publications. A question we asked ourselves then since the beginning of this work is, what does it mean to these once marginalized university communities to have a place in the physical archive? An archivist that I like to read, Rodney Carter, has argued in the journal Archivaria, archives are filled with voices. Archival power is in part the power to allow voices to be heard. The power of the archive is witnessed in the act of inclusion. So to conclude, I want to suggest that this project isn't just about making a donation of papers and recordings to special collections. I think we've seen in our work how closely archives and communities are linked. Earlier this year, Madhu Narayan published a piece on New York's lesbian herstory archives in the journal Enculturation. Narayan argued that the lesbian herstory archives maintains a unique blend of communal and archival commitments, which part of the work is really persuading community members that their lives are historical and worthy of being archived. Part of what makes the lesbian herstory archive special, in her analysis, is the kind of close-knit, in-person community it fosters. This idea, as you can probably gather, is important to our project as well. Our classes and our public programs are full of students involved with on-campus feminist and LGBT organizations. And to speak for them, I think they might say that we are offering a new space to explore an activist and social history, to sort of get us face-to-face engagement with this history. And our archivist partners at Special Collections love encouraging them to start using the archives. Our student interns who do the bulk of the interviewing work are also creating a conversation online with our project Tumblr, which I encourage all of you to follow, UChicago LGBTQ History Project.tumblr.com. The lack of sources documenting this history of university women and LGBTQ individuals and groups is an archival silence then that we are working hard to overcome. As a lot of archivist scholars have argued, a lot can be done by asking the right questions and being persistent and creative. I think that's what we're trying to do. So we very much look forward to welcoming many of you back to the center, particularly in 2015, when an exhibition in Regenstein Library will feature the things that we collect. We'll celebrate the deposit of about 150 alumni, faculty, and staff oral histories. But in the meantime, I think right now we'd be happy to take questions and then invite you to browse selections from our growing archive and look at this beautiful new building. So thank you. Yeah.
I wonder how you find the people to interview.
That's a very good question. So when this project started, we have been very much in conversation with the Alumni Association. And so our first sort of round of finding people was to send out materials through the LGBTQ Alumni Affinity Group. I think that's what they call themselves. So this has both opportunities and challenges. Much of the group, they admit very much is sort of their leadership and the membership roles are dominated mostly by white gay men. So we've been sort of catching up, I would say, in the last 6 to 8 months of trying to think about who else to interview. Word has also spread, so we have, in fact, interviewed women. We've interviewed younger and older alumni. We'd like to interview more trans alumni, but, you know, we're having sort of, we opened this up initially to the group and are responding to them. And then now we're trying to balance that with people we want to interview and how to diversify those roles. Yeah. Yeah, Emily.
I was wondering, you said you're having alumni come to you and say they want this story to be told. And I was wondering if they, in their oral histories, if they give any indication that this is at all related to recent events in the national scene, and so I mean like in the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. Do they themselves relate it to what's going on, or do they really locate their stories when they were on campus?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, I mean, again, because I think certainly, so the oldest alums we're interviewing graduated in the mid to late 60s, and we've also interviewed people from the class of 2012. The last 2 decades of alums are just sort of excited to hear this is happening. Many of them had some association with gender studies in the first place. And as they get interviewed, their friends find out and they want to be interviewed. And so I haven't really heard that context. Certainly, my first interview with David Goldman, who really saw himself, and in fact was a center of gay lib. David Goldman is retired. He and his partner live in San Francisco. they are, imagining their golden years of retirement. And he tells a very different story, a story that I, as a historian, want to push a little bit, because his story is very much the U of C, there was nothing. And we came along and there was gay lib and it helped. And then I went to Stanford. He did his master's at Stanford. Then I went to Stanford and I helped them. And now I go to Berkeley and I see all this organizing, and it's so easy to be gay on campus in 2012, 13. So I can completely understand, given his activist history, why he sees that. He doesn't participate in gay activism anymore. He's actually a medical marijuana activist now. He said that activism is at its nascent sort of baby stages. It's where gay lib was. So, and certainly I think we hear that from the older alums who were directly involved with gay lib. They may have different ideas about the marriage moment, but they do sort of see themselves in this sort of shift to acceptance. That again, I'm just listening, but I do want to push back a little bit, right, on that upward climb. So does that answer? Yeah. Yeah.
What sort of human subjects consent do you get? And do you interview any people who don't want their names revealed?
So at the U of C, like many of our peer institutions, oral history does go through the IRB process. I do certify that I'm not hurting fetuses in this work, and all the other boxes that are checked off. So we do go through that process. We've been in conversation with them from the very start. We did talk very much about having an option for anonymity, and we did decide to offer that. And I won't discuss their circumstances, but we have had only 2 out of the 70 interviews so far have asked to remain anonymous. They will be identified by their gender and their graduation year in the archive, but their names will be removed. Doesn't any? Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, it's kind of a 2-part question. Where's the house for the male homosexuals? And the other side is, I heard you say you were interviewing white gay males. Was that just limited for the purity of the study, and are you also including minorities?
We are absolutely including minorities. So when I said that we were originally interviewing white gay males, what I was saying is that those are the first people that volunteered to us. It happens to be the majority of the membership roles of the Alumni Association, the Alumni Affinity Group, and LGBT Studies. So we recognize that, and the Alumni Group recognizes that, which is why we've sort of sought a variety of other paths to interview as diverse a spectrum of alumni, faculty, and staff as possible. So obviously we're interested in race and ethnicity diversity, but also generational, age. We're looking to really have as broad a group of narrators as possible. But your first question, I didn't...
Where's the house for the gay males?
There's no, there is a house for LGBTQ students, which is combined with the Office of Minority Affairs at 5710 South Woodlawn. And that opened in, I think, 2005 as a really important sort of community space. Our research has shown that there are a lot of community spaces throughout Hyde Park since the 60s. One of our students wrote a final paper last year on the different kinds of places and spaces that have been important to community organizing. We know that there was an important sort of faculty house that threw great parties in the 80s. I won't identify where that was because it's not. So we are sort of following those links between, both social lives and also organizational, political organizing. And in some ways, 5710 kind of does both now. Yeah.
I want to salute your work here. I think it's excellent. I'm a gay alum of the Pritzker School of Medicine, and there, in the era, the U of C medical students were involved in the establishment of the Howard Brown Medical Center at a time when in medicine there was a power to the people, as sort of part of going against the Vietnam War in the era. So in the future, there's just wonderful things, including, if I might finally say, the development of the policy of the university to give spousal benefits to the same-sex faculty in order to draw the best faculty to the U of C.
Absolutely. I should mention that we had an intern last year who was a biological sciences major, and so we sort of put her on the task of Pritzker. We had actually been approached. I got a Facebook message about a year ago from a woman who was actually a 2005 graduate of Pritzker, who wanted to share her story, and from that we have been able to move a little bit outward, but are certainly interested in moving backwards. So we have some recent alums from Pritzker and thinking about both research, but also medicine and what it's like to be a gay student in the practice of medicine, which we've learned in the course of those interviews is still, it certainly seemed to us like there were still some issues at hand. So thinking, when I say sort of a diverse population, we have thought a lot about representation of all of the various schools. So undergrads and graduate students on the quads, but also Pritzker, SSA. The law school, we have some files now from Eric Weber, who is a law school graduate in '86, who founded Outlaw, the gay law students organization. So I think, that's the sort of funny thing when doing a university-based project. It's almost impossible to say what is really representative, but we knew that we needed to go to the various professional schools. And I was happy we had a scientist to help me do that because I didn't know anything. So I appreciate that, and we should talk more after this. Anyone else?
Okay,
All right.
well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.